So we are in session 7, the very last session of the day. It was a wonderful day, actually. I was fortunate to be there throughout the day. Um, so, um, so I have Cinzia and Padovani. Am I pronouncing your name correctly? Uh, yeah. Okay, good. And John Postill. And so we are at the session where we are going to hear from Cinzia and John, both of who have used digital ethnography to study different dynamics and multiple layers that social movements research bring, and also media activism bring. Both the chapters have appeared in the part 2 of the book that has dealt with data collection and analysis in social movements. And one of the main reasons why we had the book was to understand from each other and also to create a space from where we could learn from each other how to do movements research and how many ways possible could be explored to do movements research. So without much delay, I'll maybe have Cinzia and John introduce themselves, talk a little bit about what you have done, how you have come to movements research, and then if you would, maybe chat a bit about your chapters, like kind of an overview of what you have done in your chapters and what you kind of so wanted to do with it. Yeah. So I'll maybe have Cinzia start and then, John.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Doc. Thank you, everybody, actually, for this opportunity. And I know it's so late. Certainly in the UK, here is just afternoon. So, Cinzia Padovani, I work at Southern Illinois University in the US, and I've come to social movements studies from media studies. So that is my formal training. And so that's why I add a lot of media and communication activism in my observations and in my setup of the study. I won't talk much and don't talk much in my chapter about online ethnography. All I say is read John. So John's work. So I do a lot of that, but you tell me if you want me to start talking now about the chapter, or we want rather John to introduce and then we start.
Maybe if John could do a quick introduction, since it's just 2 of you in this session. And we can keep it informal, like you can take how much time you want, because we were initially thinking of 10 minutes per speaker, but since we just have the 2 of you, I guess you can take a bit longer than that. So, yeah.
Well, thanks for the introductions. No pressure then. If you refer to my work, then maybe I could refer to somebody else's work, and we can blame them if it doesn't work out. My own background is in anthropology. I started off with an unexpected project. I was supposed to be studying electronic government, e-government, back in the day. In 2002, I started a project on e-government in a suburb of Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. But that turned into a study of local activism, internet activism on local issues. So I was studying, well, I suppose more or less conservative, not very ideological, shall we say, not your typical leftist social movement work. I was looking at local issues activism using the internet. And then years later, by accident, I ended up in Barcelona looking at the activism, local activism, which had to do with the internet, with digital rights, and then that turned into the Indignados or 15M movement, which I'll talk about in a moment. So that's all I say for now. I come in some from the anthropology of media. That's my background, really.
And Cinzia, do you want to maybe go over your chapter a bit, like how you did the research? Yeah, sure.
Thank you. And I planned on about 12, 10, 12 minutes. So I'll be short. So in the chapter, of course, I offer guidelines and reflections and practical suggestions, as well as references to the literature on how to design a study and collect data on social movements, with a particular focus on their communication and media activism. So, first of all, I want to, as I just said, I come from social movements research, from media, critical media scholarship. And so I want to underline the way in which we look at media rather than according to the so-called transmission metaphor, so media as channels of communication. I prefer to use, and here I'm using Nick Calvary, a sociologist, definition of media as practices. And this understanding of media as practices can be particularly valuable, I think, for when we study social movements, because media as practices gives us helps us focus on what activists do in the process of either self-representation or relationship with mainstream media, and overall in ordering their practices together vis-a-vis the media. And the media, of course, have to be understood in a variety of ways, which I'm going to go into next. So I highlight three main elements of this media as practice. And the first one is interpersonal, face-to-face communication. So this is an order of activism that I will look at when I approach social movements, activists, how they relate to each other, but also the street-based kind of activism, such as street protest, distribution of flyers, for instance, information booth, etc. And then the second order is self-representation, how social movements activists self-represent themselves, obviously. And this refers to activist production of their own, on their own media, so-called, sometimes called also alternative media. And the third element is the interaction with mainstream media. And here I'm referring in particular to the work of Ryan, who already in the early 1990s was highlighting the importance of this element in social media activism. So in other words, the importance here and the reason why I propose this prism is through which to look at social movements activism is to avoid the tendency sometimes in some of the scholarship to only focus on one medium or one set of media. Second, I go into the ethnography and how we what we have to keep in mind when we are designing an ethnographic intervention, and the various considerations that come with that. And in this chapter, I highlight the difference between two sets of social movements that I have worked with. One of them is the progressive set of social movements, and in general, in social movement research, we have seen traditionally, and rightly so, a lot of attention to progressive movements that highlight democracy from below, citizens' participation, etc. But in my experience, and that's how I entered the field of social movements research. But then I also realized that there have been for quite some time, although there has been not much attention, but more and more so in the last maybe 10 years, there are social movements or self-defined social movements of the extreme right or the ultra-right, the so-called also neo-fascist movements. And so I highlight this difference because obviously also because the ways in which we enter the field might be different. And I draw my own experience and my own mistakes in this regard when I write about this in the chapter. So how do we conduct ethnography online as well as on the ground when studying ultra-right movements? And how does that impact, this kind of movements impact our role as researchers? So first of all, I want to highlight ethical. Now, of course, ethics is a very important part of any ethnography that we do, online, digital, or on the ground, or a combination. And acquires the ethics of doing research, acquires an additional depth when we decide to dedicate our time to studying neo-fascist movements. There are various ethical considerations that I have highlighted in two major points. One is the ethics of self-positioning. In other words, how do we present ourselves? How do we engage the activists that we work with, if they are presumably from organizations and ideological positions that are not very close to our own, right? And then the other order of ethical consideration is the ethics of representation of these actors. In other words, when all is said and done, and we have done our data gathering and we have done our field work, how do we write about these activists in such a way that we study them, of course, but we are not giving them a platform. We are not mainstreaming them in some regard in any ways, or we are not legitimizing them. So that I've been working through these, ethical considerations in my own work. And in the chapter, I talk about doing ethnography with neo-fascist organizations, movements that define, as I said earlier, themselves as social movements. We have seen a few of those here in the US, for instance, the alt-right movement that became particularly relevant during the Charlottesville Unite the Right March. In Europe, we have seen, for instance, Generation Identity, which defined themselves as a movement. It's not really a movement and died off in the mid 2010, though, that were getting particular relevance. And in my work, I've been focusing on Italian neo-fascist movements, and in particular, a couple of them, one called Casa Pound Italia and the other one called Forza Nuova. They define themselves as neo-fascist, and especially Casa Pound, the one I'm going to describe a little bit how the field work developed there. They claim to be closer to squatting organizations and very free in their approach, cultural and political approach, and very mediatic. They really use those media as practices in a very in quality, in the media production quality very high. So I entered the field very naively, thinking that I was going to enter this field just the way in which I have done it with any other social movement. I got my key informants, some personal friends of mine who I knew had contacts within the organization, and started to do my interviews. I wanted to look in particular at how women self-represent themselves on this media and in this activism. And so it went well for a while, and then just so that we know that these are not real, I mean, these are social movements in a way, but they are also very hierarchical and very top-down. Somebody from the headquarters in Rome decided that my field work had to be shut down. So I was denied at one point, in the middle of the field work, access to my respondents. That was a big issue. You can imagine I had funds, I had some money, I was in Italy doing all this. So I could recover thanks to the flexibility in the field. I decided that instead of interviews, I was going to use some of those interviews that I was able to do, but then do considerable observation of public events. Remember, I was talking about street protests or other on-the-ground events, and then, of course, look at their digital media and their production of digital media. And so, thanks to flexibility and triangulation of data, I was able to, come to terms with what had happened and bring a research to its hopefully conclusions and insights, hopefully. With regard to the last section in the chapter, I discuss briefly online ethnography. And also in this regard, I think it's important to distinguish when we do online ethnography as well, whether we are doing ethnography with far-right, ultra-right, neo-fascist movements or progressive movements. Because, of course, we know that there are safety concerns, both on the ground and online, and that some of these organizations are known for, not all of them and not everybody there, but certainly there are fringes that can be violent. And so we need to devise our online ethnography also in terms of now this distinction, I believe. So in conclusion, I have highlighted some basic fundamental concepts, what are media as practices, and the different layers of activism related to media, face-to-face, self-representation, interaction with mainstream media. And then what I think is very important is the distinction, recognizing that there are social movements of the extreme right that somebody has to study and that they perhaps deserve a special attention when we design ethnography, whether online, on the ground, or a mix of the two. Thank you so much.
I already have a question, but I'll hold it. And maybe we can hear John, if you would like to go over maybe some of the details on how you got into digital ethnography. And I think there are some students here hearing both of you. So yeah, so the kind of the more simplified it is, the easier it might be for them to understand what digital ethnography is and how to use it and benefits of it and so on. And yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. I think Lawrence had a question there. He was raising his hand.
No, I was clapping.
Oh, clapping. Sorry. Okay, good. I was clapping too. Right. I'll ignore my PowerPoint slides. I'll just use them personally, unless people really want a PowerPoint. I think I'll just talk for a few minutes about my work. So my chapter is called Doing Digital Ethnography, a comparison of two social movement studies. And what I do in this chapter is that I draw from my experience of roughly 20 years. It's a very long time now doing digital ethnography in various parts of the world, including Malaysia, Indonesia, Spain, and Australia. And in the chapter, I give an overview of digital ethnography as a fuzzy, free-spirited form of qualitative research, i.e., you make it up as you go along. And then I compare two projects that I've done in recent years, or not so recent years. The first was a hybrid study, i.e. online and offline study of Spain's Indignados or 15M movement. And then more recently, I've just completed a fully online lurking ethnography of the so-called anti-woke movement, or the anti-woke space, of some public figures that you might recognize, such as Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan, mostly in the US. And I was sitting in Melbourne studying this online space from my flat. So I call it a flat methodology, not just because I was studying this from my flat, but also because I try not to favor any one method beforehand. When I do my research, I try to do whatever works. So in my training as an anthropologist, we're supposed to elevate participant observation. It's supposed to be all about participant observation, which is fine if that's what you're able to do. But in my case, during COVID, I couldn't travel to the US and go to the various hotspots of anti-woke activity. I had to sit at home during very long lockdowns, and I was simply lurking online. I didn't participate in any of these activities. So I have a working definition of digital ethnography that may interest students and others who are new. I define it as an open-ended, both emic and etic, i.e. both based on insiders' viewpoints, but also it's still an academic, it's an etic approach. You combine insiders and outsiders' perspectives to try and understand that social world as participants themselves understand it. It's also immersive. It's inductive in that we work from the ground up. We follow the evidence. It's versatile, as Cinzia was saying. We have to be flexible, versatile, and it's also reflexive. You reflect on the practice of being an ethnographer, digital ethnographer. So you apply this to studying digital phenomena. And typically, as I say, this entails participant observation, but that's not always the case. And also typically, you'd normally expect to do semi-structured interviews, digital archival work, and other methods. What I mean by digital archival is that we often take for granted all the stuff that we find online, which more often than not comes in threads. So I spend a lot of time when I do online research looking at threads of conversation, whether it's on Twitter, on YouTube, or any other platform. This doesn't always work with every single content you're looking at, but often you find very rich threads of conversation that are there waiting for the researcher. Then I talk about digital ethnography and social movements. I'll skip that section now because I want to jump directly to my first example of a digital ethnography project. Namely, this was mostly 2010, 2011, a long time ago now, when I went off to Barcelona to the Internet Institute at the Open University to do a one-year study of activism, or, well, social movements really, in that part of the world, and how they were using what was then the very new social media. And what happened is that I decided to work with digital rights activists who were worried about the internet being taken over by big tech and also by governments. They were concerned about a new law that was being a bill, an anti-piracy bill in Spain. They were opposed to that. They wanted to internet as free as possible. So I started my fieldwork with them, with these people, but they, in the middle of as the Arab Spring was happening, they decided they would do something similar to what was happening in Egypt and Tunisia and so on, organize some protests. So my fieldwork went from being a study of digital rights activism, a hybrid study, both online and offline, to studying what I then call the Big Bang of the 15M movement, when suddenly we had millions of people protesting, not about digital issues, but rather about the question of democracy, about real democracy. So the research in Barcelona was, as I say, hybrid. It was both online and offline. And in an article that I published many years ago now with Sarah Pink on doing social media ethnography, we describe how the practice of being a digital ethnographer, doing hybrid research, can be broken down into 5 sub-practices, namely catching up, sharing. In other words, you share content with other people that you interact with online, sometimes offline as well. You explore, so sometimes you follow a lead from a tweet or from some content that's been passed on to you. You interact. When you're doing hybrid ethnography of the kind that I did, you interact both online and offline. And then you archive. As you go along, you try to archive the growing mountain of materials that inevitably you end up collecting. That's one of the big challenges of online or hybrid research, that you end up with the temptation of wanting to do big data. I've always resisted. I've never done big data. I've never felt the need to quantify my research, but it's quantitative in the sense that you end up with tons of material, and then in my case, in a very basic, very primitive way with pen and paper, I find a way through that mountain of work. And now jumping quickly to the second example, the anti-woke movement or the anti-woke space. As I say, that was online lurking. That was just me following people, often on my so-called smartphone or laptop. And I ended up focusing on the so-called intellectual dark web. Some of you may have heard of people like Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, Joe Rogan, mostly in the US, but quite a few high-profile people in Canada and the UK as well. And I was interested in their content creation, how they created this space. I was following mostly all the tweeting and podcasting and YouTubing that these public figures were doing. And it was a flat methodology out of my flat during COVID, most of it, but then it continued after the lockdowns, and mostly the Anglosphere. One interesting feature of the intellectual dark web or the anti-woke space is just how Anglophone it is. In my previous research, I'd always had to work with 2 or 3 or more languages. With this research, it was all purely English. There's very little content that was created in other languages. It's very American, US dominated. It's so what these people do are not just online practices, but they are transmedia or hybrid media practices in the sense of both legacy media and more recent media. So television is still important. Writing books, everyone has a book to sell, so printed books are important. Radio is still important, as well as podcasting, YouTubing, and so on. And these are people who place themselves or position themselves against social justice activism, against anti-racism, identity politics, Black Lives Matter, etc. They are secular gurus, many of them. They fall into that secular or internet guru category, and they are reacting to what they see as the rise of wokeism or wokeness. What I did in my research, in my online research, is that I gathered materials left, right, and center across platforms as well as transmedia. I collected anything I came across that appeared to be relevant. So it sounds like a very messy process. It is quite messy, but there is a logic to this madness in that you decide who you want to follow and you try and keep up with what they're putting out there, what fans and foes are saying about them, and you put it into your folders. So I don't do any of that. I don't use any qualitative software. I just use good old Office folders and Word documents, very rudimentary. And pen and paper, as I said earlier, I do lots of mind maps. I take notes by hand. It's the same principle that you use when you go to a lecture. When you go to a lecture, you don't need to do a word cloud. You don't need to do quantitative analysis of the lecture. To me, it makes more sense to go and take a few notes and get to the gist of what's happening there. I triangulate, as Cinzia was saying earlier, triangulating is very important. So the more you diversify your materials on an issue, the better. If it matters, that the key ethnographic principle really, in my view, is that if something matters to the people you are working with or that you're following, then it matters to me. If these people are talking about Black Lives Matter, then it matters to me. If they're talking about Ukraine, then Ukraine becomes a big thing for me, and so on. And also importantly, I always write up the materials that I have, not the materials that I wish I had. This is something that PhD students sometimes find quite difficult because we all set out with some research questions, or most of us. And in this case, I didn't have any research questions. And you want to answer certain questions. But what I've discovered over the years is that the less questions, the better, in a sense. The less you have a rigid framework, the better. You have to be open to whatever comes next. It's a very exploratory approach. And the most effective method of all, which may contradict what I said about a flat methodology where you don't favor any methods, the most effective method is a real deadline. When you take your deadlines seriously and you have to produce a paper, you have to deliver something within a time scale. The result of all this is a book that's just come out. Speaking of promoting books, I haven't got it on me here, but it's called The Anthropology of Digital Practices. It's just come out, and the subtitle is Dispatches from the Online Culture Wars. So very briefly now, what I do is I like to call it open source ethnography, in the sense that I'm working with public materials, with content that these public figures have put out there voluntarily. I don't go into any private groups. I work with public materials for this project. I mean, as I said, it's non-participant observation. And one of the things I really enjoy is when they go on a podcast and they're talking among themselves in the podcast. It's got nothing to do with me. I didn't set up the interview. They're interviewing one another. It's a natural interview, or a natural focus group in inverted commas. And I really enjoy listening. Sometimes I don't listen to this to all. If it's 7 hours long, I may not listen to all 7 hours, but I do like going in there. And I do rely also on comments from people who actually, from the nerds who followed the podcast really closely. I look at what people had to say for and against that content. And this is all happening in a hybrid media system, what Chadwick calls a hybrid media system, i.e. a system where, as I said earlier, we have old media, but also new media, television, Fox News in America, GB News in the UK. They are broadcasting corporations, and they're still very important because often the highlights, content that is highlighted from from those older media circulates through social media, and then often it recirculates back into the older media. So more than anything, I collect digital stuff. I don't make, for this project, I mean, for the anti-woke project, I didn't make any friends. I made what's known as parasocial relationships. This is, if you like, a parasocial anthropology. It's more parasocial than social. I did not create any content. Some might say it was parasitical anthropology. I like to think it was parasocial. I was a content collector more than a content creator. And so to conclude, how can social movement researchers apply ethnographic methods? My suggestion in the chapter is through a process of trial and error, like the rest of us. You try, you see what things work, which is what we do in life anyway. We see what works, what doesn't. It's a very there's no right and wrong as long as you stay within ethical guidelines. You don't go around abusing people or misbehaving. In methodological terms, it's incredibly open-ended. We even incorporate quantitative stuff. If other people have done statistical research, we're happy to use it if relevant. And then through that process of trial and error, you separate out what works from what doesn't work without favoring any method from the outset. And finally, I don't see any need to try to emulate the hard sciences. I used to be a bit of a semi-positivist back in the day. In my younger years, I was a little bit positivist. In other words, I used to think that the hard sciences were in some ways better, but now I've come to the conclusion that there's no better or worse. Whatever works, no need to try and be like the hard sciences. Thanks for listening.
Should we see? Yes, Lawrence has. Okay, he's clapping. I was thinking that Lawrence has a question. Should any of you want to? Thank you both. And I should have mentioned this before, but you probably already figured it out that we are recording the session. It's too late to mention that, but Lawrence did press the recording, and I think all of us heard that it's recording. So I completely missed mentioning that. So there are some students here. I have a few questions, but I'd like to see if any of the students would have any questions, or anyone who is in the audience would want to ask a question to John or Cinzia, and maybe take those first, and then we can use the chat box. Yes, Lawrence has a question. Yeah.
So yeah, I did actually then have a question after. It's a question to both of you, which is related to my own thinking about the difference between what we often present as kind of left and right movements, as though they're the same kind of thing. And I liked very much, Cinzia, the way you said, well, actually, they're not quite the same kind of thing. For example, on the dimension of pushing for democracy in internal practices versus being quite top-down, or being quite capitalist in their sort of promotion of competing gurus with their various products, versus attempts at, relatively self-generated material for somewhat internal purposes. I don't want to overstress those, because one of the bad things of progressive movements at the moment is how much they look like right-wing movements sometimes, full of grifters, and so on. But what I did want to ask you both is about the methodological changes that we might need when we're dealing with, let's say, relatively more egalitarian situations, economically or in terms of who is producing, who is consuming, and relatively more unequal ones of power, privilege, and so on. Are we researching people in the same way if they are mostly listening to Joe Rogan and shouting along? Or if they are involved in this kind of, the elaborate construction networks of the movements of the 2000s?
Yeah, personally, thank you, Lawrence. I've asked myself that question a lot. Also, some of the distinctions, I don't want to be to assume necessarily that, for instance, violence is only, we're going to find violent fringes only in certain sort of ideological social movements. But structurally, certainly the language that they use, the anti-woke, I think, examples that John was giving, or I've been following also some female, anti-woke personalities who are also very interesting for the ways in which they assume an anti-patriarchal positioning in their work. Very interesting. So these different ideological positions really challenge some of the assumptions. But I want to say that with regard to what one could consider extreme right movements, I think that violence is more structural and maybe less episodical. And also the language that is going to be tending to be more exclusionary than inclusive. The position of the researcher, and I don't know if I'm getting to your question, Lawrence, but the position of the researcher with regard to media and how these groups produce their own media, that's also very interesting. But it's also a challenge. You said the capitalist system, like, for instance, the anti-woke or, the women who are big social media personalities. Yeah, certainly they need to typically go into a for-profit social media environment, even if they then move from X to migrate somewhere else. I mean, the principle of the algorithms are going to be the same. But we should not underestimate the importance of interpersonal communication, the small print. So John was talking about books, right? So these organizations, these movements that I follow, they have their own prints, their own book publishing enterprises. They are anti-capitalist themselves. So they're going to find ways in which they will promote their own communication, in which that might surprise some of us. So being flexible also in how we presume that the differences are among these groups. And then for my point of view is also how my ideological identity then might get into the way of really having more productive I don't know, more meaningful insights when I do this kind of ethnographic work, both with people whose worldviews are more similar to mine. How critical am I? What kind of support and insights can I offer them? Because I don't want to forget, not even for a second, that also our work is, at least in my case, it's also normative. I want to advocate. I want to use my research for something, my time, and the position in which I am for causes that I believe in. So, how much of that is gonna interfere with my ability to be critical of some of the more progressive social movements that I might have found, who can also be exclusionary in their language, who can, and vice versa, my antipathy towards neo-fascist, how could that cloud maybe some relevant claims and grievances that I might have? And indeed, that they do have some grievances that are that might be valid, and that's in a way scary to say, but the experience of the last 10, 15 years politically has told us that these movements do have a anchor in real life and real concerns. Yeah. Thank you.
It's a very difficult question. In my case, part of the difficulty is that the first project I described with the 15N movement in Spain, the Indignados movement, which I then continued in Indonesia with digital rights activists. But focusing on the Spanish case, that's quite different, doing a hybrid study where you're participating with people, where you have your research participants who know you and you know them. And I was sympathetic to their aims. I was critical about some things, but overall I was sympathetic to the 15M movement. That's quite different from an online study where there's no interaction. So I don't know what I would have done. It would be a very different study had I decided to do hybrid research, let's say with the far right in Melbourne. I could have, after the lockdowns, I could have studied something different. I could have said, well, I've done enough of the content creators that study fascist groups in Melbourne. That would have been a very different study. And I think some of those concerns that Cinzia outlines, that would have been relevant here. The other problem is that as an anthropologist, we have this, it's very hard to get rid of the disciplinary identity. Once I was trained fully all the way through as an anthropologist. It's very hard to let go of this emic perspective and trying to do justice to the people you're working with. Even with the people you're working with, you disagree with fundamentally on a number of issues. So being an ethnographer, I see an ethnography as something not that different from a novel. It's almost like being a novelist in the sense that you, certainly with the content creators, I saw them as characters. And there's a danger there that affects the researcher, but also society as a whole. If you see someone as a Donald Trump or a Boris Johnson or a Joe Rogan figure, if you see them as a bit clownish and entertaining figures that you find fascinating in their own right, the danger there is that you miss out on some of the underlying stuff that's going on. Many of my anti-wokes describe themselves as classical liberals, and they say things that sound very liberal, but clearly they're connected to more hard right ideas or alt-right ideas, and the boundary is very fuzzy between the two. So there's that issue as well. You're not often, when you study the online anti-woke movement or anti-woke space, you're not quite sure where you can place them on an ideological spectrum. I try to be, unlike Cinzia, I try to be non-normative, and this sometimes gets me into trouble when I'm trying to be academic, shall we say, objective and do justice to who they are without demonizing people for their ideas and so on. I try to separate the two, not always successfully. With the Indignados movement, I wasn't very good at separating the two. It was just part of being there on the ground. And so to answer the question directly, the ethnographic method, because it's open-ended and inductive, runs against this idea of saying, well, because I'm now working with the right wing, with a far right, let's say, I have to behave differently. So there's that tension between the open-endedness of an approach that says, well, let's keep an open mind. I'm not sure exactly who these people are. That's the point of the study, that I want to understand who they are. I want to assume that they're not all necessarily monsters, that they are as human as everyone else. And that clashes with, there's a tension there with your own political convictions. And I'm not sure we ever resolved it, but my answer to all this is to try and gather rich empirical evidence and say, well, this is what the evidence suggests about these people. Yes, it confirms that they call themselves this, but in reality, they're doing this other thing. Or I discovered new things. I've discovered that some of them are genuinely centrists and others are more, you keep an open mind. That's what I normally try to do in my research.
Thank you both very much.
Could I ask maybe one question? And since Cinzia was mentioning about Casa Pound, I was thinking about this question. I do research on illegalized migrants in Rome, Italy, and I have also kind of tried to get into the detention center, Ponte Galeria, to collect stories. And say, for example, I'm a racialized, precaritized woman or a scholar who is doing research using digital ethnography and don't want to do ethnography in person, but kind of choose consciously digital ethnography. What kind of barriers I might face if I am doing research on an organization as Casa Pound, or not? Like, what could be the benefits, or what could be the barriers doing research as somebody who is of maybe a precarious identity? And the same I was thinking when it comes to an anti-woke movement. Since I teach in women's and gender studies program, we do study what's happening to trans, intersex activists, students, just ordinary people who are sexualized, and also with the kind of the anti-abortion issues that are going on in the United States, and so much literature that has been produced by the far-right movement. What kinds of maybe problems one who is sexualized is getting involved into this kind of movement? And when you're getting involved in the movement, you're not just getting involved in understanding the movement or understanding the content or doing a frame analysis, but you are also generating research. So people are getting to know what you are doing somehow. And so if you are coming into the field with the kind of identity that I'm talking about and doing this kind of research, what benefits might be there if you're doing digital ethnography and not directly getting involved, but indirectly you're doing it, and what could be possible barriers or problems?
Well, yeah, these are very important questions, Dapa. And with regard to saying that you're saying how, if I were doing digital ethnography and looking at a group like Casa Pound, that they are so active on their social media. There are other groups, of course, there are other movements, but that might be one. Is if you are overt in your identity and you present yourself as a researcher, or instead, if you're just lurking. Now, if these are public, sorry, I keep getting the sunshine. I cannot even see you anymore. If you're just lurking, and these are public social media, then that's public knowledge, and I wouldn't participate that much, because somebody could get onto you with regard to what you're saying. Sometimes they are not very tolerable with anybody who comes in and presents positions that might be challenging for some of these groups. But of course, if you're looking at their, say, Facebook, now Facebook has become very sanitized environment. We are not at a time like 5 years ago, even, where you could really follow a lot of debates, right? And as John was saying, and then follow the threads and find out some very interesting data there. Things have changed a lot. These organizations have been shut down. Social media have to have more control over what is shared. So it's limited what you could actually find. But I think I would be lurking. I would be observing, from a distance without really expressing your identity. Now, there are also situations in which, in particular, Casa Pound, they claim not to have any problem with gender fluidity, for instance, or gender identity, that they are very open and inclusive. But I don't know that you want to try that. In terms of also migration, I've done quite a lot of studies on their discourse about immigration and migration in general. And they seem to be, on one level, very open-minded, very inclusive, and reasonable, even. To go to John's point, yes, I agree that there is a lot that we can, that we want to gather the rich empirical evidence, and some of it is reasonable. But I would do that from a distance, from a digital distance and physical distance as well. Because personally, I've got into, getting into the field in a way, very naively, thinking that starting from a person to person and, at the same, physical proximity would have protected me, also because I have friends in the movement. But then that's not quite the case. So, Sutapa, I don't know but if you need anything with, as you are looking into the Italian situation, please let me know. I'd be happy to. Do you speak Italian? Do you read Italian?
A little bit, yeah, yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
The other thing I'd suggest is that when it's a tough space to be part of, you can also sometimes, there may be hacks and leaks that are in the public domain. Perhaps there are whistleblowers within the organization, or people who are disaffected, who left the far-right movement and are willing to talk to the other side, to a progressive researcher. You have investigative journalism. These far-right groups have been researched quite a lot by journalists. So sometimes you find rich things that are not, it's not your primary research, but we should never neglect other people's primary research. See what's already out there and do something with it that hasn't been done before. And you can also have the more moderate the PR wing of, as Cinzia was hinting at, you have sometimes they claim to be inclusive and open to ethnic minorities, etc. And you can talk to them. I'm thinking of Gabriella Coleman's research on Anonymous. Researching Anonymous wasn't that easy, but she found a channel. She found some areas where Anonymous were interacting with the press, with the media, and with one or two researchers who were there. So there will always be issues of access. We're never going to have total access to the core, and we don't necessarily want to study the core. Sometimes it's you learn more from the more marginal figures who may not be the leaders of the group, but they have a lot to tell us, and they may be happy to talk to a researcher. Someone who feels they're lower down the pecking order, they might be more willing to talk to you because they feel they're not seen enough. So this is their opportunity to talk to someone who takes an interest in what they're doing. A lot of people want to share what they're doing, their passion. And the way to approach them as a researcher is to approach them with a genuine interest and not, straight away saying, well, I hate what you're doing, but can I talk to you? Find some kind of a common ground, even in difficult cases. So there's a lot of, and going back to my initial point, people leave a lot of traces online. There's a lot out there. There are Reddit groups, for example. There are Reddit groups where nerds of all kinds, including far-right nerds, they go into very arcane detail about who did what when within that particular group. There's a lot of gossip online. There's a lot of gossip that escapes the bounds of even private groups. Obviously, if you can get into private WhatsApp groups in a safe way, a lot of stuff happens on Telegram, WhatsApp. That's another way, of course, but that's higher risk getting into some of these groups if your identity is revealed. Talking to IT geeks is always helpful. Seeking advice about your own internet safety is always a good idea, to keep updated on how to protect yourself from possible attacks.
Thank you so much.
One final point. Digital ethnography is not the same as online ethnography or lurking ethnography. Digital ethnography can be participating in a cafe with someone. It can be a face-to-face. So I think it's important to distinguish the digital ethnography, which is the blanket term, anything to do with the digital and that has an ethnographic approach. That's different from lurking or online research. There are distinctions there.
Lawrence is here. So what should we do? I think we are almost to the end of the session, and I just cannot thank both of you enough. It was fantastic, and I just feel so fortunate to be there, to have the opportunity to hear all the sessions. It has been such a rich day today. And it also talks to the wealth of information of knowledge that has gone into the book with all your contributions. So I'm extremely thankful to both of you. And I think if we don't have any questions, we can close here. If Lawrence wants to say something.
Well, I mean, to thank you both, because that really thought-provoking in lots and lots of ways. And it is a challenge as a social movement researcher who learned the trade several decades back to make sense of, well, what even is this landscape? But maybe just also in terms of the theme of this, to say, if we've got our tech right, we will be uploading this on YouTube with the view that it will reach a wider audience, with the view, of course, that people will then go and look for copies of your chapters, digital repositories or send you emails for PDFs. And we're delighted to discover that somebody has already pirated the whole book on LibGen. So,
well, this speaks volumes. Speaking of books.
yeah. So the goal has been, with this whole day, has been somehow to get the work that people have done out from under this very narrow, very exclusionary publishing model of handbooks that cost £200 into a wider audience and into the hands of people who are not yet in well-funded universities with those kinds of libraries. So thank you very much. And this will reach a much wider audience than the people who are here right now.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
organizing it.
Thank you both.
Thank you for organizing it. Thank you, Sutapa, in particular. You have been fantastic, really patient with me personally, for sure.
No, I feel it's vice versa. I feel the same. I feel the same way with everyone. Like academic work is such these days that they make us juggle so many things at the same time that it just doesn't leave us enough time to do everything the way we want to. So thank you both, and thank you everyone. Actually, it has been extremely like a learning episode, and I mean it just tells that there's no end to learn. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you.
It's nice to meet you. Thank you.